Well, good afternoon and good morning to everybody on the West Coast side of the house. Thank you so much for joining us today. I think we're going to get things going here. We're looking at 3 minutes after the hour, and I've noticed the attendees have sort of boosted up and it stabilized a little bit there. So we'll kick things off from there. So first and foremost, thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Theo Van Wyk, and I am head of cybersecurity here at CDW Canada. Today, we have the opportunity here to review and talk about the 2020 Canadian government security landscape, that study that we have. And we'll get into this a little bit more and talk about it and some breakouts around what we've looked to accomplish here. So first and foremost, just welcome again. Thank you for making the time and joining us today. We have participants from literally across the country, so exciting. A little bit about housekeeping items. I would be more than happy to field questions throughout the call. Now, the one thing to notice here is that your calls will be muted, but if you type anything in the, preferably in the question and answer box, please, once you type that in there, we will gladly address some of these as we go along in terms of the slides, and some of the questions, depending on time, we may park for a little bit later. Please feel free to ask if you feel there is a question around some of the areas that specifically on the slide that you'd like to dive into a little bit more. We're going to quickly look at our 2020 security study for CDW Canada, and that forms the foundation of the specific government breakout study that we did, and I'll talk about that a bit more. Then we'll deep dive a little bit into the 2020 study, look at some specific government related cybersecurity elements that we've seen in the landscapes and some trends, and we'll look at some key findings, and then we'll open the floor really for some Q&A and see if we can get some discussion going there for the afternoon. So just quickly, overview of CDW Security here. So CDW Canada has 900 coworkers. We have 9 offices throughout the country. You can see on the image there. The real big thing here for me is just we're in the fortunate position that we have national reach, so we can help out customers in various regions there. So I'm assuming most of you are familiar with CDW, but if you aren't, CDW is actually an established and trusted IT services and solutions provider. Many times I know CDW is seen as sort of around the reseller side or like fulfilling orders, but we actually have a significant services practice as well, which is I'm excited to tell you a little bit more about. Now at CDW here, when we tackle security, we attempt security in the format of a prepare, defend, respond. And in essence here, which is our approach, so around prepare is understanding business, it's doing things like business impact assessments, threat risk assessments, and then that spills over for us into the defend portion, which is application of technologies or solutions to then help solve those business problems. And then on the response side, it's really items to help organizations run those solutions and or recover or respond to threats. The reason I'm highlighting this here is this is sort of our overarching program that we layer on top of the NIST approach. It's loosely based on NIST 800. And you'll see that as we dive into the actual study element as well. Within CDW, we've got 100 plus security-facing professionals. So these are resources dedicated to client to assist with security. We also have a 24/7/365 operation centers as part of that response tier to help people manage solutions where they may need help with. If you have any more questions about our security practice, I don't want to spend too much time on that today. Please feel free to reach out to myself or to any of your account executives, and we'd be glad to deep dive into that a little bit more. But without further ado, let's dive into our 2020 security study overview. Very quickly looking at this one here, the 2020 study was actually our 6th annual study that we launched. This was a study that was started under a previous acquisition named Scalar Decisions that CDW acquired, and we continued that tradition and that behavior just because we found it was so valuable for our customers. And really, the history of the study that we did is we realized there was fantastic information around North America in general. There was fantastic information for Europe, but let's face it, Canada being the Great White North is a little bit different from all of those. And so we wanted to get some information unique to our organizations and what people in Canada are facing from a security perspective. And so we launched our first study, and that has just continued year over year. Now for this year, we are actually sharing it's not raw data, it's a pivoted version of the data, but you can really go and have a lot of fun and lose yourself in a ton of information. and that is available on the link that you see on the screen there. So if you go to www.cdw.ca/security data, you can actually get a copy of a lot of the pivot tables and analyze some of that for yourself for fun, if you're so inclined. We also have the actual full security study at cdw.ca security study if you want to download and read that. Now, the other great things I could mention, like we based this loosely around the NIST 800 framework, and this was really important for us to have some consistency, but also that it maps into what organizations are experiencing and as people are looking at standing up security programs. But in turn, what we're looking for here is the hope to help us foster a better understanding of the industry and be able to provide some thought leadership. I'm hoping to share some of that with you today. We also do learn a lot from our customers asking questions. So again, like if you have questions, feel free to don't hesitate to ask us those. Now, I'm going to touch quickly on this because this is very critical for how we want to approach the messaging around the study. When you look at cybersecurity versus cyber resilience, we try to focus the study on cyber resilience. And I've had some people ask the question, like, what's the difference? Why is that relevant? The reality is, when I talk to organizations, unless you have a very secure maturity program, the majority of people, when they hear the word security, tend to default back to a protect or a prevent element, right? And the challenge we have with that is it limits discussions purely to the security group, and it tends to silo things in an area where it shouldn't be. And a lot of times, too, that leads to a technology-first approach. So you run into a situation just where the decisions are being made to protect, to prevent, and I'm absolutely advocating for that. Prevention is still better than a cure. But the reality is to keep in mind here that every study that you see coming out now, either very high 90s or 100% of the respondents experienced a security incident somewhere along the way. And so the danger in cybersecurity is when there's a breach, at least linguistically in a lot of people's minds, immediately security has failed. Security should be the purpose of preventing that. What we really are excited about resilience is resilience says we're going to try and do everything we can to prevent that breach. But should the breach still happen, we're arming you, you're armed with, and you're in a mindset that allows you to recover back to it, to respond, recover to that trusted state, and then carry on with business so that the business can actually survive. So only once you fail at resilience, that is when it's really catastrophic for an organization. In addition, this helps yourself and internal people to focus on a services or consulting style approach. It opens up the discussion for people to have a broader conversation and for you to involve other stakeholders as well. So key findings from the cybersecurity study. Now, again, this is the actual study that was nationally done. I'm going to quickly touch on this because we're actually going to highlight some of the specific findings for the government sector later on, just so you can see some of the contrast. But when we looked at cybersecurity at the landscape as a whole within Canada, what we found is one of the big topics that people were wrestling with this past year was AI-based security study tools. And so I should also say this is for results done at the end of 2019, so just before 2020. We're very curious to see how COVID and things will affect it next year. So when you're reading these statistics, just keep in mind this is sort of pre the new era. But I think it still holds for the security arena very much. It still very much holds true in most scenarios. So AI-based security tools are being used to increase cybersecurity effectiveness. And when organizations get this right, we get reports that they're actually doing well and they're seeing a significant change. But we're also finding out from organizations that they're struggling to unlock that full potential and to get things working the way they preferably would. Around ransomware, we're seeing ransomware becoming more frequent. So we're going to dive into this quite a bit because this is one of the key findings for us around the government sector as well. Now, what was really interesting to us is that 63% of our customers reported an actual loss of access to data. So it wasn't just that the laptops or the endpoint got encrypted, the actual data on servers and shares got impacted as well. And so that obviously is a different degree of outage and concern as to when you just have end users that are out of action. Now, the stat that was really shocking for us was that 80% of the respondents said that they, soon after recovering from the attack, they became reinfected with the same ransomware again. So, and I should say 80% of the people that suffered an attack would then actually suffer a reinfection. So definitely saying something towards how we're focusing on protection tools and maybe detection tools, but how the recovery portion of this evolution cycle still needs quite a bit of work. The other items, there was a big item in the study that came up was third-party suppliers and security. it remains a significant struggle for our partners and for our customers. And the reality is that 82% of the respondents here experienced some form of security incident due to poor partner hygiene. And the real danger in this one here, and you can use Best Buy as an experience or Home Depot if you're familiar with those attacks. Again, the names we're uttering when we have these conversations are, Best Buy, Home Depot, Marriott, and these are the brands that we associate with the breaches, when the reality is very few people can name in all three of those cases the third party that actually caused the original breach. So the damage remains with your brand, even when the incident is caused by a third party in your environment. So just that makes that 82% so much more of a significant stat to be aware of. Purely integrated cybersecurity and enterprise risk management strategies. We're going to dive into this one as well. This is significant. This is not an easy one to solve, but when people apply energy into this, we do see a significant improvement in their security posture and the number of attacks being mitigated. Slow remediation and increased work effort resulting in rising costs. You'll see this one as well. This is one area where the government divisions or the government businesses that we interviewed are really struggling with, and it shows in the cost. So the moment you are not as fast as that recovery phase, you can't get business back up, it's taking a long time to respond and return to its trusted state, it significantly adds to the cost and the damage that a breach or a security incident result in. And then adoption of cloud-based initiatives is outpacing cloud security strategies. This is one of those stats that I don't think is surprising to anyone. And especially, I would imagine on our next round with the current state of situations, this is going to be even more significant, and how people have just rushed to adopt cloud and not necessarily always allowed cloud security strategies to keep up in the evolution and their security programs to stay current. Now, about the 2020 government cybersecurity landscape, let's dig it in a little bit. Let's narrow it down a little bit more. First off, I'm going to go over just a few concepts and a few elements that's important for us when we consider this data set, because it gives us some context against when we compare this against the rest of the nation. So again, this is actually our first time that we've done an industry-specific breakout. In the last 2 years, we've got regular requests, and so we're really excited that we actually got the numbers broken out this year. This provides information, so specifically for this breakout is focused on Canadian government security, and we have a slide that will break down for you the different municipalities and government organizations and how that makes up our respondents for this specific survey. And then the idea here is really to do some comparisons. In addition to findings that's unique to the government sector, is to find some, to just look at how the public space and the government specifically is comparing against the national average. So really, to some extent, we do see it break down a little bit against private sector versus public, if you will. But the reality is within government, there's still some unique items as well that our government customers are dealing with. So cost of breaches. So the first number I want to dive in here quickly is when we look at that downtime, I mentioned we're going to touch base on this here. The average business days of downtime for a security incident is a very significant part in how we factor in and calculate the breach cost. Now, there's in the actual full report, if you download that, we do show a breakdown that gives you all the factors. So if there's elements of that that you want to tweak to see specific how it relates to you, feel free to do that. We also calculate a per employee cost roughly to give you an idea. I always struggle with if I'm a 10-person or there's a 20-person organization listening to this, and they're seeing a smaller organization and they see a $2.7 million breach cost. That's a number that is devastating for an organization like that. So we try to put in perspective. Again, in the study, we break that down a little bit. This year's number, I believe, landed around just over $3,000 per employee. So you can do a little bit of mental math to start getting a better idea of where that positions you on the scale. Now, when we look here, the numbers in brackets here is the national average across the main study we did, and then we're looking at specific items here. Now, I want to break out the three types of incidents that we've classified. So when we did the study here, it was important for us to understand when people were causing service interruptions, but not putting your actual data at risk. So denial of service, the one on the bottom that you're seeing there, 27.8 days average to recover from the incident of business days impact. This is actually FTE applied to it as well. This was significant because this is just something that people are going to hit your public-facing services and your attack surface with. And so it's just something that you have to deal with, and but it's not necessarily an impact on data. And when we look at the 27 days there, that's contrasted to 23. So you do see a little bit of an increase, maybe not that significant, but definitely a delta there. Infiltration for us, the way we've defined that in the survey, is once somebody gets past your defenses, but you do not have an incident where PII or actual corporate data is impacted. And what we're really looking for that is once you start getting into that exfiltration phase, which is then when the data is impacted, you start moving into the realm of having to do disclosure to disclose information because of impact to the information. Now, infiltration for us here could be something like a ransomware attack that lands on a laptop but just encrypts the local user's laptop and doesn't make it further. Exfiltration here, of course, becomes when that data is that hops over to a server with sensitive information, or an attacker pivots, and you find that attacker potentially had access to information and could have exfiltrated that. So again, 22 versus 21 days, so not a significant difference in those two types of attacks. But when we look at the national standard, that's 17 versus 18. And so when you look at the delta here, this is really combined with the mandates applied to resolve this. This is where we see the number then that we found that on average, and again, this blended across a large group, but on average, the number we landed on was $2.7 million per year spent on cybersecurity attacks to recover from those. And this is in contrast to 1.1 when we do the national average. So governments are definitely targeted. It's definitely financially more impactful for a government sector organization when they do get breached or attacked. So moving on here, we actually had a question on this one coming in advance, so I'm glad I can address this for you. Or sorry, just on the next one. But what we want to do too here is we're trying to look at respondent employee size. So we do try to break this out to understand if there's any specific trends or patterns that I need to be aware of and that I have to compare separately from the national study. And so when we look at this here, 79 respondents out of our 524 fell within the government sector categorization, and we'll break that out a little bit more in a second. Small for us is everything like realistically 0 to 250 employees at the government institution. And so in this case, it was, excuse me, in this case, it was 18 of the 79 respondents, or 23%, was small organizations. And when you contrast that to the pie chart, which shows us the national respondents from the report breakout, that equates to like a roughly 20%. So we are maybe a little higher, but very close to on par. So we know we can look at those statistics equally. Medium large was 35 organizations at 44%, and this spans 250 to 5,000 employee range. And the 44% here is actually slightly below what we saw on the national average, which was at 50. And then enterprise size 5,000 and above, we had 26 respondents at 33%. And this year, in turn, this is where you see some of that shift where the percentage actually exceeded the national respondents. But overall, fairly close, marginally deltas. So we know that we can do fairly accurate comparisons between the numbers, and we don't have to account for anything there. Distribution across the country, again, just here, wanted to be, again, an idea so we can be aware if there's specific geographic areas in Canada that's seeing behaviors or patterns that's different or influencing the results. But we actually have a fairly even spread this year. So we have 15% for Western and Central Canada. So Ontario is on the higher side, closer to 50%, and then 22 for Quebec and 15 for Atlantic. That is weighted a little bit more towards, towards Ontario versus the general study results. But with, so just again, something we're aware of, something we're tracking, but in our findings, this did not skew the results specifically in any direction. Government level breakdown, this is the question I mentioned that we had beforehand, was just asking around how is the 79 number made up of? You can look here. I'm not going to read through all of this for you, but the top three was broken down around municipal, local government, provincial, and then municipal local agency. And that consisted of the majority. So, again, I know there's a question around some data. We're looking at breaking out some specific information around the municipalities, but feel free if you want for any of the other categories to see, and we'll put those requests in, and then we will make that available as we can. So key findings. So all of this is really good. But what did this tell us? So you saw the key findings for the national report. What we found really interesting here is one of the higher key findings and points that stood out was that government agencies struggle to quantify and assess cyber and business risk. I don't find this surprising. Generally, when we look at Canadian government agencies, they are more complex, they're more dispersed. It's typically a lot of groups. They sometimes tend to be more siloed. This is not a rule of thumb, but it's just in some of our experience. And so naturally, when you have this focus areas and a wider distribution, it's just not as straightforward to quantify and assess. So when we looked at how this was broken out, the 11.3% actually had full cybersecurity and ERM integration, right? So we're looking at how do I assess risk, how do I look at this, and how do I tie this back together? And then 15% of the government agencies had centralized risk management. Now, when you look at the statistics at the bar on the bottom there, centralized risk management, ironically, was actually better in the government organizations, but they fell behind on the integration between their cyber and their risk management programs. So what can when we look at that, what do we see as some of the factors that's driving this? If you look at the graph on the right there, there's an actual breakdown of what organizations are struggling with. We're seeing that prioritization of the actual controls that's being deployed is actually fairly on par with the industry with the national results we saw. 60% for inventory was actually pretty accurate as well. 43% for discovering vulnerabilities was slightly on the lower side. Again, we contribute that somewhat to the environments and just to how some of the setups are occurring. And then the two numbers that stood out for us here was the 36.6% on tracking risk on an ongoing basis. So that is below the industry standard, and it's obviously something that our respondents felt was more difficult. And then the other area was assessment of business impact. We found that was also slightly below. So just again, it just shows that there's potentially some work to be done here around tying those risk programs together and making sure that your cybersecurity strategy is supporting your overall risk management plan. 50.7% of the respondents actually had said they had comprehensively covered third parties in the resilient plan. Now, this is actually really good because we saw that third party was a significant risk. And when we looked then at the national average down below, 36% roughly is where the national average landed. So the government agencies are at least in the respondents here, are feeling that they've got a better grip. They are tackling this more aggressively. And that is a really good trend for us to see. Now, 83% of those agencies then reported experiencing a cyber breach due to the pure hygiene of the third party. So again, a really, really high number. The good news is that more organizations feel that they have a handle on it. But again, a significant attack vector when you do not have a handle on it and you're not comfortable with that. And then compound that with the fact that we start seeing like extended leeway or extended times for recovery, for response and recovery back to a trusted state. And then that explains why some of these attacks and some of those breach costs are significantly higher that we've been seeing. So finding number 2 for us, strategy shift focus towards detection and response. From detection and response to a defend. This is really, really important for us. We follow this very closely. I'd say 3 years ago, one of the biggest things that stood out on the study for us was just how many of the organizations in Canada, both public and private, focused on that protection phase. And in the reviews today, like what you'll see here, like when we looked at the study findings, the most of the effective security controls today included endpoint, email, and identity access management. And that is very positive for us because this forms the foundation of what you need to actually build onto that response, the detection and the response. These are the kind of tools that arm you on the endpoint to have the ability to respond. It gives you identity so you can understand, is this specific user? Who do I reach out to on a human element to work with or to help address the issue? And then email here is a big one too, because as you know, with ransomware, that's one of the main attack vectors. The one that didn't make it in here that I would like to see in the future as well, but we kind of assume that will be built in under the next generation firewall platforming as well, is the web, actual web as an attack vector. So we still see that today as the majority of the 2 threat vectors coming in as email and web for organizations. So the trend, though, that was really encouraging is we're seeing a shift towards detection-based technologies. So we're seeing more organizations within the government sector start talking about next-generation firewalls, visibility tools such as SIM and ITSM. And this is excellent because if we can accomplish this, this really sets you up for that integration of the risk management program, because just integrating peer technology tools into a risk management program is very difficult, if not next to impossible, if you do not have that intermediary tie that holds it together. Now, only 2.8% actually said to have used an incident response retainer with the MSSP. So what this leads us just to show is that the majority of these breaches are being handled internally, and the government agencies or organizations feel comfortable with that, and that's fine. I think it's worth noting that when you still see there is a discrepancy in the recovery and the response times, so definitely worth looking closer to see if you can improve that potentially by looking at some incident response assistance. But again, to be assessed on a case-by-case basis and really to be baked into your business impact assessment considerations for that. Strong adopters of AI and ML tools. So this was really different and very exciting for us. The government organizations actually scored very highly around adoption for AI and ML. Now, this also included items such as security tool sets that leverages behavior and pattern analysis. So the definition of AI and ML was pretty broad here. But at 68%, if you look at the graph on your right-hand side there, you'll actually see that it places government organizations high towards the significant change in effectiveness. And this is important because, again, organizations said it's more difficult to get a grasp on, but once you do, it really accelerates and really strengthens their security program. Finding number 3, not a surprise here, I think, for anyone. If you've read the news lately, ransomware is really rampant and causing a lot of issues. What's interesting is that when we asked respondents about their concerns for attack vectors, ransomware started replacing the denial of service, specifically within the government sector. So in the private sector, like number 1 threat was still insider threat, hands down. And then I'd say, depending on the region or like how you slice the results next, denial of service or ransomware sort of became the second threat, alternating. The majority of the organizations that we looked at here actually were said that DDoS was responsible for about 27.8 days a year of outage. Now, again, that's more significant than the national average. And then infiltration results attacks was 22. So again, very damaging. So you're seeing like once it gets in, once that ransomware lands, it is causing significant outage. But I think the real number that stood out for me here is 88% of the organizations indicated that they had a reinfection of a repeat attack of the same ransomware after they recovered. So, you know, you look at the experiences at ransomware, the number above there, and it shows you that 70% of the network infiltrations was ransomware. So definitely a high attack vector. Apologies for that. So definitely a high attack vector, but infiltration. The real issue here was that even the reinfection rate was very high, which shows us that returning to a trusted state was difficult for a lot of the agencies and the organizations here. What was also interesting here is that the actual remediation portion that we found was relatively quick. So government agencies were relatively fast to respond and resolve it, but the root cause was not found and addressed, and then that resulted in a significant reinfection. So finding number 4, deficiencies in planning for incident response and recovery back to trusted state continue to create post-breach vulnerabilities. We sort of built up to this point already here, but we wanted to dig a little bit further into why we're potentially seeing this. And what we found is that only 19% of the government agencies had fully documented and regularly updated response plans, and then only 16% had fully documented and regularly updated recovery plans. Now, a very interesting statistic when we broke the numbers down for the national study was the group that had the most challenges returning to a trusted state was actually not the group with no response plan. We were pretty sure when we were going to stack rank the numbers that people with no response plan would obviously have the highest time to recover, followed then by somebody with a response plan, even if it's regularly updated, and then ultimately the fastest response being people with an updated response, like a regularly updated and baked response plan. But what we actually found was that if you have a response plan, but it's not updated and not kept current, the time to recover from a breach actually exceeded not having a response plan on average. And in digging further into the results, the closest thing that we could land to this explanation was if you have no plan, everybody jumps in and goes into problem-solving mode, and we start fighting the attack. if you have a plan, everybody sort of goes into this default mode of trying to follow the plan. And if the plan is not current or outdated or not applicable anymore, you actually end up in a worse situation than just going into problem-solving mode and fixing it right off the bat. Ultimately, still considerably the best number was to have a fully baked and regularly reviewed response plan. And so that's why when we see numbers like 19 and 16, again, like the interesting thing when we look at the response plans for the government at the bottom there was actually higher than the industry, but the recovery plans reversed. And we saw that reflected in the numbers when we calculated like how people responded on their actual breaches. 82% of the government our respondents believe that they can return to a stressed state in less than 24 hours after a breach. That was actually a significant number for us as well. It shows a high level of confidence of recovery. But then when we combine that with the stat again of people actually experiencing reinfections, it tells us that this is a band-aid solution. So in this case, recovery is restoring service, getting people back up, probably through re-imaging or golden images being rolled back up to laptops, but not necessarily a track down of the root cause or finding the issue that caused it in the first place. So this slide here, I'm not going to walk through detail here. This is just for a moment. Your eyes can peruse down here. This is in the actual study breakout where we summarize sort of at a quick glance for you. You can see how the government organization scored against overall. Interestingly enough, was actually a less number of attacks. We are not certain if this is just because the government agencies are still moving more towards the detection phase as opposed to the prevention. So is this just the fact that they're not catching all the attacks, or is it a case that attacks probably is a little bit more focused, or maybe that the other industry is just over-reporting? Either of those could be situations. What is interesting here again for me, just when you look at the first three numbers, fairly close, but then you get to that cost of incidents, and that is a significant delta, more than double. And then, like I said, like we get into that recovery phase where this really comes into play. So recommendations, we're going to touch lightly on this. The obvious one here would be ensure that your organization is properly identifying and tracking cybersecurity risk as part of a holistic cyber plan. And while that's a one-liner on the slide there, that is no easy feat. It's extremely difficult, and we acknowledge that. This is where you work with potentially internally, but this is where we see the real value of third parties, firms assisting you and coming in, doing some of these assessments, understanding business impact, understanding threat risk assessment, making sure you understand where the crown jewels and the sensitive information is in your organization. How are employees interacting with it, and how are they working with that? Once you understand that then becomes the foundation for investing and deploying security tools to make sure that you address that first. It's the only way to ensure that you're getting the right return on your investment for your security plan. Integrating your ERM and cybersecurity and risk strategies. This really forms a function of what we just talked about. You have to do that pre-work. You have to understand your threat landscape and who your threat actors are that potentially is going to be looking to target you. And then once you do that, and we can quantify that in an element of risk, then the real key thing here is to tie those two together. One of the interesting areas we saw in the national report was organizations that reported that they had to be PCI compliant generally scored a lot higher on this integration, and then in turn scored a lot lower on successful breaches. And one of the items that we surmise on this is that PCI in those organizations at a very early stage forced compliance to start thinking about cybersecurity in a risk manner. And just over time, that's naturally been more ingrained. And so we do see the results out of that. So definitely, start aiming towards this. This move plays into that whole play of shifting towards detection and response not away from, but in addition to just your protection phase, and making sure that you can build on that. And then ensure that you can return to a trusted state after cybersecurity incident. Obviously the faster you can recover, but I'd also say this, the key here is not just to an operational state. The key here is being able to return to a trusted state. So have I found root cause? Have I patched, remediated? Am I comfortable with, do I actually trust the platform? As opposed to just an operational state where people are back up and running and potentially leaving yourself open for a reinfection or that avenue being utilized again by a different threat. And then assure that purchase vehicles are set up to allow government agencies to correctly consume security technologies that's relevant today. Very interesting thing on here. We've been, as CDW, we've been partaking and been on a number of vehicles where the descriptions was very rigid in how it was set up. And so what we ran into was a lot of cases when those items on that or programs on that vehicles were being leveraged, the technology, because of the velocity of our industry and how it changed, had actually outpaced the vehicle and was not relevant anymore. So one of the recommendations here is, as we look at this change, and especially as the government agencies are looking at adopting SIM and next generation firewall platforms, AI, other tool sets that really drive innovation even faster, is make sure that when you're issuing these, set yourself up for success in providing definitions that allows you to leverage those technologies as they a year or two down the road as needed. Thank you very much. So that was a lot of information from my side. At this stage, we're going to open the floor for questions. So, Jason, not sure if we have any questions that came in.
We don't have any new questions in the Q&A box, but we do have some questions that were sent to us ahead of time. Are fake phishing schemes from IT to the rest of the corporation a good way to test employee awareness?
That's very interesting. I'd say yes, if you follow it up appropriately. The danger with phishing schemes for us is, depending on how it's written, people do get conditioned and get used to it. So you have to be cautious in how you use that metric. But even within CDW ourselves, we regularly use those. We craft those very specifically. And we do get a varying degree of success. I'd say what really in my world defines successful is not just whether you got the employee to click on it or not, right? We've been really advocating to move away from a blame and shame game to education and awareness, to truly embrace those concepts. And to really do that, what's really critical is how you follow up on the click. So for instance, I see this a lot where people do their generic training. It's sit through half an hour or 25 minutes or an hour. If you're in one of the unfortunate organizations, you're sitting through this course, you click some multiple choice questions, you get a certificate. Congratulations, you passed your awareness training. 6 months later, this phishing attack comes out, you accidentally click on it, and you're being sent to redo the course, to sit through it again and click and say you've got your certification again. While that is still better than nothing, we feel at CDW that misses the point significantly. If you're going to use these type of tools, make sure that your follow-up that comes out of it is actually in a manner that teaches your employee why they clicked on something incorrectly. And what we actually do is we'll actually break down the exact phishing attempt with great detail in the training course and explain to them what the items were, that caught them, why we believe it was successful, as opposed to just pushing generic training again. And we have found a successful tool. We have seen click rates reduce significantly, but it is not the true and only measure, because we've also had cases where we have click rates down significantly, and one of our pen testers comes up with a brilliant new idea, and suddenly people fall for it again. So not the ultimate tool, but if you can close the feedback loop, definitely very valuable.
We did get a question in the Q&A box. Can you throw some more light on the influence of AI solutions in detection and response capacities?
Absolutely, yes. So it's an interesting area that the industry is grappling with. I think we are very cautious to use the word AI, just because that implies the network is truly intelligently doing things for you. And while we can definitely automate, I also want to be very careful about that. Where we do see significant application, and this is really the area where we've seen the most progress, especially on endpoint, that's really where we've seen this change, is in the area of machine learning. So having that ability to build these models that looks for patterns that we do not know to describe yet, right? We always run into this around SIM tools, for example, is the other area where we really see this as well. Traditionally, in a SIM solution, I'd have to come to you and say, define all the bad things that I should be monitoring for you. And so you write a ton of cases and a new issue arises, and we write a monitor rule for that, and then it never triggers again. The other alternative then was to say, well, tell me all the really good things that I should not worry about. And that was equally as difficult. Where machine learning and the new models are coming in and becoming really handy, and where we've seen it make the most change, is that ability to create a pattern of behaviors weighted in different ways that actually starts catching things that we haven't even thought about or seen yet. And when you start feeding that into something like a automation tool, that you can take that and further vet the information, build that case, and then ultimately still potentially hand it over to a human analyst, but have done a number of the pre-work. That's where we see the true value of sort of that AI and ML, specifically within the security industry. The other thing is security resources are hard to come by. It's definitely something that you want to up your employee satisfaction and engagement rates. And so if you can automate and use AI to get rid of or to take care of some of the mundane and automated, like repetitive tasks, and actually use your human intelligence and your human capital to do things that excites them and that they really want to do, I believe that's the true win of AI, is when you can combine those two. But again, specifically like SIM endpoint, like finding the telemetry and then analyzing the large number of logs. Again, it's not easy. That's why you see that stat about people reporting that they struggle with it. But then you also see the stat that once people find the right fit for their organization and they get into it, they then see a significant improvement in their cybersecurity and helping them maintain it.
Okay, another pre-submitted question. With municipalities being targeted, is there a population size of municipality that is targeted greater than others? For example, are cities with populations, say, greater than 250,000 targeted more than those that are under that number?
So it was interesting. We went back to the data to have a look at that. I do not, like the respondents did not reply by actual population size. We do have the number by employee size. So if you gave me the latitude to make a general assumption and say that a larger organization with more employees will typically be suited as such because they're targeting or they have a larger region or larger public group that they're serving. If we make that assumption, then yes, what we've seen is in our stat, like large government entities that has 5,000 and above see significantly more attacks. So where the average was, like around 400, we actually saw them well in excess of 500, and some reporting as high as 800 to 900 attacks. Now that can also be a function just of having more infrastructure and a bigger attack footprint. But either way, like they are dealing with significantly more incidents. We further broke that number down a little bit to look at the type of attacks, see if there may be a specific type of attack that targets the smaller organizations versus the larger. The reality is it didn't really make that much of a difference. It could maybe make small reversals in whether it was DDoS versus ransomware, but those were always the top two that we saw, regardless of how we broke out that number.
Another question submitted into the Q&A box. Seeing as most government agencies have shoestring budgets, what cost-effective strategies can you recommend for us to obtain such solutions?
So I think the quick answer is determining the right solutions for you. So, obviously there are more complex solutions, but I think the first thing to do is make sure that the dollars that you do have is being spent in accordance with your security program, and it's going to support what's relevant to your organization or to your security plan to move you further along maturity curve or confidence in protecting the network. And that's why, I know it's a very broad statement, that point one on the slide we had, but understanding your threat risk, those threat risk assessments, those business impact assessments, you don't necessarily have to do them on the organization as a whole, but definitely do them on the data and the services that is your crown jewels or that's vital to you as an organization. So understand the threats around that, understand how your users are using that data and how to secure in those services, and how do you secure it. So I'd say that is step one to then focus the budgets you have, fully acknowledging that they're shoestring. I'd say the next thing after that is we are seeing more and more, and I want to be careful not to advocate open source tools, but we are seeing more and more tools that are incorporating some of these, what typically would be features in large, in enterprise style solutions. So there are elements that you can work, and we can even work with you to find some of these that would work. The challenge I have at the end of the day with open source is it's a trade-off. Aside from the fact that support and availability could be an issue, the challenge, the true expense with open source becomes the maintenance and the ongoing updating of the tool. Other than that, I'd say if it's significant, work with your security providers. There's a number of vendors that do provide government-based discounts. So definitely something that we can look at and finding suitable solutions. Now, there's also, with the advancement of a lot of the other features, what I'm finding is in the actual security tool sets, the gaps are shrinking significantly. We used to have a time where you have your one product that was way above everything else, and you sort of have a bit of a middle pack, and then everybody else is trying to catch up. We are seeing more and more tools that, let's say, fits within the upper 60% of functionality and features and ability, but giving today's buyers a significant range of options. But that is something, again, that has to be right size and right fitted for you and based on your scenario. And that is where you work with your security partners to help you flesh that out.
Another question that was pre-submitted: have you identified any significant divergence in targeting trends directed towards federal versus subnational governments?
So I pulled out the data as much as I could based on those stats, and we didn't really see. I'd say the DDoS attacks, again, was slightly higher on federal. I found local and smaller municipalities and sub-regions were really hit hard with ransomware, but it wasn't a significant difference. Like, it reversed the order, but it wasn't that I found, at least in the results that we saw a massive delta in that. So I would say that the quick answer is no. They seem to be fairly straightforward. I think the one area that is difficult to gauge is because we didn't have a specific question asking for a data point around that is around national threat actors. I also think that's a more difficult one to judge, to very clearly articulate or look at. But that is the one wild card that I would hold up my sleeve. But I do not have specific data to back that. I also think those attacks generally are much more advanced attacks. So, well, definitely something that's more difficult to judge and to measure on.
Okay, what is the level of cybersecurity awareness training in the government sector?
So we've actually looked. I'm sorry, I want to just grab my numbers here for this one. We actually looked at that, and it was actually very much on par with the regular industries. Now, what I found interesting was the majority of the training was being done quarterly, which for us we feel is actually a very good cadence. It's a good frequency. There was still a very significant amount of training being done semi-annually, and then there was quite a bit of training being done monthly. So I'd say it broke down to the majority of the training truly being quarterly. And I think that quarterly is a good frequency, especially if you can close that feedback loop that we talked about, right? Do your training, launch a campaign, and then do the retraining, a focused retraining based on that. Now, whether ideally you should do that quick retraining quite soon afterwards, but if you count sort of your main foundational trainings that you'd follow up on, quarterly seems to be the mix that we're seeing a lot. And that also aligns with where we typically feel is good enough that you're not exhausting your audience. Like, once you exhaust your end user, then you very quickly lose traction overall. So definitely don't want to exhaust them. Want to keep them engaged. Want to keep it interesting, but want to keep it frequent enough that they do not lose track of it.
And Theo, what role does email play in security?
So email and security is huge. Like we had talked before, the two main attack vectors that we see today, we can use three. The three would be social, would be web and email, and it really alternates between which one is more frequent depending on what the current the main attack type or threat is out in the wild. And then the next one really becomes sort of social engineering. And the reason I like to put social engineering in there is social engineering usually ends up in a form of a web or an email attack potentially as well, right? So sometimes it's a blatant social engineered, sometimes it's a blatant email thread or email-based attack with actual malware and payload that gets detonated. The majority of the times, the email as a vector becomes extremely important with social engineering. So this is where you see things such as your whaling, your wire fund, your wire fund fraud and transfer, where people are losing significant amount of numbers. But it is email predominantly as that threat vector being used to accomplish this. Like, I know one of the municipalities close to me here in Ontario, they got hit really, really hard, and they lost a significant amount of money with wire fraud and transfer through a whaling attack. So Definitely, it removes the human element. It's not live. I'd say the interesting thing with a web attack is there's still a level through web as a threat factor. There's still a level of interaction and being live and ongoing, whereas email has the danger of being disconnected and sort of sit and wait for the right time to be acted on, right? So you can shift context. Well, for instance, of what we do in a lot of pen tests is we know organization deals with peer later. We'll simulate sending a delayed shipping notification from peer later or an invoice from peer later, and we'll send it at an odd time, because the idea is we want that employee to have enough time to form a thought process in their own mind around the service and then see the matching email. And then the human psyche comes back to that social engineering portion. That's the human psyche being fantastic at jumping and linking dots. And that becomes a very challenging. So email is very prevalent, layering that with a proper anti-spam solution on the front for the inbound. And then this is why we feel so strongly about the web filters. Like a lot of these attack vectors, once they break in and once they get in through email as a vector, they leave the organization through web as an outbound. So you want to cover both those threat vectors very well, and that'll lead to a significant reduction in threats.
A couple more questions into the Q&A box now. Is there data in the study that shows what percentage of government IT teams are dedicated to security?
There is data in there. We'd have to go break that out for you. You won't find it in this report specifically, but I believe we do have the data. So Robert, if you want to take that, we can pull together a quick table on that, and we can share that out with the attendees. Oh, sorry, Jason, if you wouldn't mind taking that number.
Sure. And then another question, I think this follows up on the email security side of things. What's the most popular email filtering service in the government sector?
That I do not have a straight answer for you. I'm not familiar with how the actual market share breakout based on the actual the vendors. I'd say if I think industry overall, we see a very healthy balance of sort of your traditional Gartner Magic Quadrant, upper right Magic Quadrant vendors. So I'd say if you look at those, that's really where you'll see a combination. Things like Proofpoint, Cisco-based solution. Microsoft is still very, very significant as well for organizations in Office 365. And to be honest with you, it ends up really boiling down to whether organizations believe in, a lot of cases, in whether they believe in unified platforms. So, do you have a Cisco Fabric or do you have a Microsoft Fabric in your organization and you want to tie seamlessly into that? Or whether people actually believe, I want to call it best of breed. It's not that the others are not strong solutions. They're equally as strong, but call it best of breed in the sense that it's a variant, it's a layered approach where they're splitting up the ability to detect threats across different vendors who potentially will have different signatures and visibility types.
This is the last of one of our pre-submitted questions. What firewall architecture is recommended to secure a Microsoft Azure infrastructure as a service or platform as a service environment to satisfy protected B guardrails?
I'm going to give you the horrible answer here. It depends. The reality is the majority of native tools and the majority, again, of those upper right-hand quadrant vendors out there today has the ability to do it. And I want to be very particular about this because, we kind of see this in the cloud consumption, the shared responsibility and cloud consumption models that we deal with as well. I'll sort of use a different analogy for a moment. Just because a cloud vendor is PCI, it can support PCI and is PCI capable, doesn't make you PCI compliant by leveraging that platform, right? A lot of it still sits, and again, the IaaS versus PaaS versus SaaS is really good that you've embedded that in the question, because it really depends on that shared responsibility model, how much of that falls on you versus the provider. But ultimately, it still boils down to to making sure that you're actually adhering to the framework. So I'd say, especially from a firewall perspective, the actual architecture becomes a lot more important around how you zone, how you log. There's a lot of descriptive factors within ITSG 33 and Protected B that is going to dictate for you like how you should do it based on your environment. And again, this is where working with an organization, like either internally with your architects or with another organization, to truly understand that environment is key, so that you can deploy your tool sets in the right way and manage them in the right way, that you are not actually putting yourself at risk or outside of compliance.
Another question in the Q&A box. Any practical ideas or strategies around how to handle ERM, looking at cultural constraints within municipalities?
Let me digest that for a second. The quick, I would imagine, now I'd love to understand better what some of the cultural constraints are. I think that will drive a little bit of like how you look at that. I think the reality is you probably want to start with a top-down approach. So what I find is when you can position people on the why, or different organizations and sectors, and you can see what the win is for them and the benefit, that is really going to be the way to convince people and to change it. I'd say, again, from an enterprise risk management, it's articulating the risk relevant to that party. So if you have a specific risk that you're trying to solve on a business level, that particular party or group may not feel that it's relevant or applicable to them, or they may just not understand why the business is concerned with the risk. So being able to explain the risk in a manner that they can grasp, and then potentially furthermore explain the risk in a manner that's relevant to them, should get you to that first step of getting them on board and getting them aligned. After that, tool sets and execution still is quite a bit of ground to cover, but I would start from that perspective, as opposed to tackling it from controls or a technology level. So that is in our experience, when we can get our business and our customers behind the thinking, and making them understand what we're accomplishing, that is the first significant step in solving the people part of the people, process, and technology triage that then brings the process and the technology together.
And that's it, Theo. There's no more questions at this point.
Well, that is right at the top of the hour. So I want to take a moment, just say thank you to everyone. Thank you to our attendees for sticking with us right to the end here through Q&A. I appreciate it. If there's any other questions that come up or anything else that you think of, please feel free to reach out to us as a team. We'd be glad to have more discussions with you, and we have some takeaway items that we'll work on, and we'll get back to the group. So with that, thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful day, and we'll talk again soon.